Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you all and kick off this webinar on deindustrialization and regional transitions. How can places transform, leaving no one behind? Organized by the OECD Spatial Productivity Lab, SPL in short, in collaboration with the OECD Transforming Places project, which is funded by the UK Research and Innovation. I'm Carlo Menon. I'm the coordinator of the Spatial Productivity Lab, and I will moderate this webinar for you today. We have a rich agenda ahead of us, and I'm particularly want to especially welcome and express my gratitude to the three external speakers who accepted our invitation for today: Enrico Moretti, Tim Bartik, and Irene Tinagli, were three economists that are not only very well known for their work, but especially for their effort to contribute to the public debate and to engage with the real life policy challenges. So without further ado, I leave the floor for a quick introduction to Rudiger Harend, who is the head of a division here at OECD that deals with urban and regional economic analysis, data, and statistics. So Rudiger, why are regional transformation such an important issue here at the OECD?
Yeah, thanks, Carlo. Indeed, we care a lot about deindustrialization at regional level. And the reason for that is, even though we all know that when we're having structural change, a lot of jobs are being created. But the jobs that are lost, they're often very, very, very clustered. They're in the same place. And so even small economic shocks can have huge effects on local communities. And then that adds, we're already having a problem with relatively large inequalities between regions and countries. And then if you're having this deindustrialization, these shocks, then that's adding to these disparities, and that can deepen the existing inequalities, and that can then also even pose this dilemmas and problems with political stability and the health of our democracies, as we have seen, for example, in the geography of discontent literature that has been very prominent in the press and also in the academic debate in the last years. Then on top of that, the deindustrialization may also further widen the gaps between the global tech hubs, which are typically the capital cities, and the other parts of the country. So there really is an issue with inequality that's been arising from the decentralization that we've been seeing over the last decades. Now, you might have the point that deindustrialization is something that happened when basically China was entering into the world markets, but that's not true. It's not a thing of the past. For example, we're seeing in Europe, there's currently debate about Volkswagen, and there is a possibility that the car maker may be closing plants in Germany, and 15,000 jobs could potentially be on the line on that. So there is still deindustrialization going on. And if we're looking at the statistics, we see that between 2019 and 2023, in the EU 27, we've been losing 500,000 of jobs in industry. And countries like Bulgaria and Slovenia have lost more than 10% of their manufacturing jobs. So, it is an ongoing issue. It's not just something that happened and we are now beyond that. One of the problems also is that we don't really have a relatively good understanding of what deindustrialization means. And the studies by Enrico Moretti and Tim Bartik today are really very, very important studies because they're shedding light on this issue that has been hugely under-researched in recent years. And what they're showing, among other things, is that that regions recover from economic downturns in very different ways. And there's still a lot of things that we actually don't know why some areas bounce back and others continue to struggle. And that's also something that we in the OECD are working on, and Anna Rubin is going to say some more words on that later on. Also, finally, basically, when you are seeing job losses in the industrial sector, not telling news to most of you, but the effects are typically not concentrated there. There is a lot of spillovers to other industries, local services, but also the broader regional economy. And then they're having a lot of, follow-on effects, generally equilibrium effects. Typically house prices are crashing, makes it more difficult for people to move away, or also, generally speaking, I mean, you can also get to a situation where basically because situation looks dire, people are moving away, enterprises are not coming, and you get in kind of like negative spirals. So there really is a problem there with complex policy challenges, and that's really something that I mean we are talking about today in the seminar, and that's also basically that's a bit the rationale what's going to underlying this whole debate. With that, I give the floor back to Carlo and then to our speakers. I'm very excited of listening to your talks today.
Thank you very much, Rudiger. I think you made very clear the reason why we want to engage in this debate today. So the next speaker is Enrico Moretti, who is the Michael Peavey and Donald Weyer Professor of Economics at Berkeley, and one of the scholars that probably contributed the most to advance our understanding of how local labor markets work. Enrico is also very, very popular outside academic circles, mainly because he wrote the book, The New Geography of Jobs, which inspired many policymakers around the globe. It was also praised openly by former US President Barack Obama. Enrico, for your most recent paper, The World's Rust Belt, you and co-author assembled data for almost 2,000 cities in 6 different countries to understand which places declined because of the manufacturing crisis and which ones were able to recover afterwards. So Enrico, please tell us more about this piece of research.
Thank you, Carlo, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can we start with my slides? Great. This is joint work with Luisa Gagliardi and Michelle Sarafinelli. Next. As Rudiger and Carlo made clear, manufacturing employment has been declining in most industrialized countries. And in this first figure, we just show employment in manufacturing in the 6 countries in our study: France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, where employment is scaled to 1 in the year of that country manufacturing peak. So, for example, in the US, employment started declining in the 1970s. And you can see in the graph, employment being 1 in 1970, and you see the following decline. Employment started declining in the UK in the same decade, in 1970s. Italy and France, the period of deindustrialization started in the 80s. And for Germany and Japan, the industrialization started in the 90s. But irrespective of the exact date of the manufacturing decline, you can see that the rate of decline is generally consistent across countries. Next. As Rudiger has mentioned, the effect of deindustrialization is not the same on communities in each of these countries, because some communities started with a large share of manufacturing employment and therefore experienced more painful effects of deindustrialization compared to communities where manufacturing employment was not a big part of the local economy to begin with. So, for example, the obvious example in the US is Detroit. Liverpool in the UK and Duisburg in Germany are also good example of places with a strong manufacturing base in the year of their country manufacturing peak. And therefore, these are examples of cities that suffer painfully the loss of manufacturing jobs. So not surprisingly, industrialized countries have started adopting a growing number of place-based policies that seek to reignite economic growth and employment and investment in the communities that were most hit by the manufacturing decline. Next. In our project, we study the employment consequences of the industrialization in almost 2,000 local labor markets in these 6 countries. And to do so, we put together the best available micro data set, and we try to harmonize them to the extent possible. In the first part of the project, we describe what happens to changes in employment in the period of deindustrialization of each country. In particular, we focus on heterogeneity in employment. So how different was the experience across cities? We focus on former manufacturing hubs. So Detroit's, the Liverpool's, cities that had a high share of manufacturing employment in the year of their country manufacturing peak. In particular, cities that were in the top tercile of manufacturing employment in the year of their country manufacturing peak. And what we find is that within this group of cities that were strong, where manufacturing was a very important presence in the local economy, there's vast heterogeneity in the employment changes during the period of the industrialization. On average, they lost employment, and that's not surprising, but some did much better than others. And in fact, there is a large share of these former manufacturing hubs that fully recovered and even exceeded the previous employment levels. Next. So in the second part, we ask why? What explains this difference across communities, these profound differences across communities in the employment experience during the period of the industrialization? And we focus on one important factor, which is the human capital of the workforce, in particular how well educated were workers in those cities when the industrialization began. And we find that cities that had a high share of college graduates in the labor force were more likely to recover. And when they recovered faster. And this was largely explained by growth in human capital intensive service, which more than offset losses in the manufacturing sector. Okay, let me show you what we find with a bunch of graphs. The details are in the paper, which is available on my website for those who actually want to see all the details, but I'm just gonna focus on some key graphs here. Next. So this is the first, probably not very surprising relationship. On the x-axis, I put the city share of employment in manufacturing in the year of the country manufacturing peak. So cities to the right have a high share of employment in manufacturing. Cities to the left have the low share of employment in manufacturing. And on the y-axis, I have the subsequent growth in total employment scale per decade. And you can see a very strong negative relationship, indicating that cities that started with a strong manufacturing base lost employment in the decades after the manufacturing peak. And these losses came from two sources. First of all, they lost employment because manufacturing declined, obviously, and this is the most important loss. But second, as Rudiger was mentioning earlier, there are additional spillover effects, right? When you lose manufacturing jobs, you also lose jobs in the local service sector. You lose jobs in construction, in retail, in restaurants, and so on. And so on net, you can see that the Detroits, the Liverpools, the cities with a strong manufacturing base that are on the right lost a lot of employment during this period. Next. This is another way in which you can look at it. Here, time zero is the time of each country manufacturing peak. And we show the experience of three groups of cities, the one in the top tercile, which are cities with a very strong manufacturing base to begin with, the one in the bottom tercile in green, which are cities that started with a lower employment share at the beginning, and cities in the middle. And -1 would be a decade before the relevant country manufacturing peak, +1 would be a decade after the relevant country manufacturing peak, and so on. And the graph is really stark. What it shows you is that in the 2 decades before the beginning of the industrialization, cities with a high share employment in manufacturing and a low share were performing similarly in terms of employment. But after the period of industrialization began, you see a stark divergence with the cities in the top tercile of manufacturing performing the poorest, and the cities in the bottom tercile of employment in manufacturing performing the strongest. Again, suggesting that there is, like, starting with a strong manufacturing base at the beginning of the period was painful in terms of job losses. Next. This is, so what I've been talking about so far was the mean the average across cities, but within that average, there is tremendous amount of heterogeneity across local labor markets. So let's focus on just one column of this table, which is column 1, which shows us that within the group of former manufacturing hubs, what share was able to fully recover in the period of the industrialization. So I just show you that on average, they perform poorly, certainly worse than other cities in their own countries. But column 1 shows you that the first row shows you that on average, 34% of former manufacturing hubs in these 6 countries completely recover from the negative shock of the manufacturing losses. So more than a third of the cities did, in relative terms, did quite well in terms of employment growth. And even more interestingly, and I think this is a large share, frankly, these are cities that were hard hit by manufacturing losses, and yet more than a third of them did quite well in the period after the industrialization began. Even more interestingly is how these shares varies across country. The share is the lowest in the US, where only 17% of former manufacturing hub recovered. And the share is highest in Germany, where almost half of the former manufacturing hub recovered. Put differently, this is saying that the cities with a strong manufacturing base in the US perform much poorer compared to comparable cities in other countries. And this is something that will be really interesting to investigate. Next. The second part of the paper is asking why. Why do we see this much heterogeneity in the experience of these cities? These were cities that all started with a strong manufacturing base, but some really did poorly in the decades after the industrialization began, while others fully recovered. So what explains this difference? Well, I think this is the beginning of a research agenda here. We're not going to provide all the answers, but we're going to focus on one important factor that in our mind played a key role, which was the initial level of human capital of the residents in those cities, which we're going to measure in the study as the share of residents with a college degree in the year of the relevant country manufacturing peak. And we're going to ask the question, is the initial college share associated with faster subsequent employment growth during the period of the industrialization? Next. One great example of our hypothesis is the experience of Pittsburgh in the US. Pittsburgh was the capital of steel and coal in the US, and in the 50s and the 60s was one of the major manufacturing hubs of the country. But Pittsburgh, starting in the 70s, started a really painful decline because steel and coal jobs evaporated. And just like Detroit, just like many other Rust Belt cities, it started a period of tough times with major losses, employment losses. But Pittsburgh also had a very highly educated labor force. It has 2 important research universities and a high college share, a share of college graduates that is high relative to population. So Pittsburgh was able, in the years of the industrialization, to attract a wealth of other industries, high human capital, services that are intensive in the use of human capital, that offset the employment losses. For example, Pittsburgh attracted a lot of jobs in healthcare. And increasingly in high tech, Uber, Google, they all have offices there, and they call it the med economy, with a lot of education jobs, a lot of medical jobs, and increasingly a lot of tech jobs. And so the question that we're going to ask is the experience of Pittsburgh representative of other manufacturing centers that had a strong human capital basis? Next. And essentially, the answer is yes. You can see here a graph where we divide cities not based on the initial manufacturing shares like in the previous graphs, but this is here we're dividing cities based on how well educated was the labor force at time zero, the time of the manufacturing peak. So here, the cities are divided in quartile, with the top in blue being the top 25% of cities in our sample in terms of share of college graduates at year T, in year zero. And what you see is quite remarkable. In the 2 decades before the industrialization began, so before we start losing manufacturing jobs, college share, or human capital more in general, doesn't really matter for employment growth for these cities. But in the 4 decades after the industrialization begins, you see that college share increasingly matters, with the cities in the top quartile growing faster and faster, and the cities in the bottom quartile growing slower and slower in terms of employment. And the cities in the middle growing at an intermediate rate of growth. So you see, basically, this is a great divergence that other people have also alluded to, that really points to the fact that education was a key determinant in economic recovery for these places. Let me show you the last graph, and then I'm going to conclude because I think I'm running out of time. Next, it just shows the employment in knowledge, human capital and knowledge intensive services. So this is a subset of employment. These are services like the one that I alluded for Pittsburgh, high-tech, education, medical services, and so on. And it shows you the same graph, with the cities in the top quartile growing fast and the cities in the bottom quartile growing the least. Let me conclude. Next. So on average, cities where manufacturing was initially more important experienced lower employment growth. That's probably not too surprising. But what's interesting is that this average masks vast heterogeneity across communities. More than a third of former manufacturing hubs grew faster than their country mean, with the US having the lowest share, indicating that Rust Belt communities fare relatively worse compared to their peers in other countries. Next. And we also find that one factor that raised the probability of recovery was the initial share of workers with a college degree in the labor force. The reason was a faster growth in human capital intensive service, which more than offset losses in manufacturing. And so our key conclusion in terms of what to do is that investing in higher education of local workers seems to be an industrial policy. I put it in quote, but I really believe it. An industrial policy that might increase the probability of recovery of communities that are hard hit by manufacturing employment losses. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any question in the Q&A session.
Well, thank you very much, Enrico. It was quite impressive analytical work. I think you did a great job in extracting the key findings and policy messages. I think also it's very, very interesting that you set also a bit of the research agenda. So we take home the message about investment in education, but clearly there's probably other policies that may be effective that can explain a lot of the diversity of patterns that you were able to show to us. And a special thank you in the light of the fact that it's not even 7 a.m. in Berkeley. So really appreciate it, you joining us today. The next presentation also looks at the topic of regional decline and recovery, but with an additional focus of inequality of outcomes. Indeed, typically we don't care about places or regions doing bad or good or per se, but we care about the people, the communities living there in these places, especially those that cannot migrate to other places, and especially the most vulnerable groups. So really an additional important question is whether economic success is shared by all residents when a region manages to catch up after a negative shock. And this is exactly the type of research that Tim Bartik and colleagues of the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research have been doing recently. Tim is a senior research economist there, and is also a very highly cited scholar for his work on local development policies and the role that public policies can play to support local communities with, let's say, I think almost 40 years of consistently impactful research on these topics. And I would say also unique ability to merge frontier research with very concrete policy implication. So Tim, in your most recent paper, which is titled Broadly Shared Economic Success since 2000, you explored these topics and it also create a database that is publicly shared. So Tim, floor is yours. Please tell us more about this interesting piece of research.
Okay, if you can move the slides forward. Okay, this is joint research with some of my colleagues at the Upjohn Institute, specifically joint research with Brad Hirschbein, Katie Boulder, and Kyle Weisman. Let's move on to the next slide, and I'm just going to summarize a little bit what some of the key findings are. So one thing to mention, we just heard from Enrico, this is looking at something different, not employment growth in local areas, but looking at labor market outcomes for workers in terms of average earnings in particular. And we look at different labor markets just in the US, that's all I'm looking at here. And one of the things we find is there's enormous disparities that some areas do much better than the US in terms of labor market outcomes, some that do much worse. And that these trends, furthermore, they're not consistent across different groups, either by education or by race. As I mentioned, I don't fully understand. I think we need more research on why these trends differ. I'll mention at the outset, I don't think we fully understand these trends. We need more research. There is some clues. We did some descriptive regressions that suggest some clues. We've also done some case studies that look at what the policy issue is, how you can improve this. And finally, I'm going to make little remarks about the racial disparities I find, which are very disturbing and that we really need to do more about. Next slide. So this is kind of the key slide I want to present. And so I'll spend a little time on this. So as I said, we looked at local labor markets from 2000 to 2019 in the US. So business cycle peak to business cycle peak. We're looking at labor market outcomes. We looked at a variety, but we focus here on real earnings trends. Now, I should mention that this real earnings includes earnings, workers with zero earnings. So we're looking at changes in real earnings that could be due to more people being employed or could be due to the wages they're employed at. Both are being looked at here. We also look separately at wages and employment rates, but I'm not presenting that here. We're looking at real earnings changes that in particular, we're controlling not just for national price changes, but for local price changes, which are very disparate in the US due to different changes in housing cost. In addition, we control for demographics. So when I present trends for different groups, within each group, I'm controlling for other demographics. So when I look at different education groups, for example, I'm controlling for the age distribution within each group, and within that local area, I'm controlling for race. When I look at different racial groups, I'm controlling for age distribution and education distribution. So we're controlling for that. And we looked at local labor markets here are defined as what in the US are called commuting zones. We looked just at the commuting zones that had more than 100,000 population. There are 371 of these in the United States. Together, they comprise 96% of the US population. So most people live in these 371. Now here, I'm just going to highlight 8 of them. And I deliberately picked them to show some of the contrast. So we have 2 areas that are kind of high-tech local labor markets, San Francisco and Minneapolis. 2 places that are Rust Belt that Enrico already mentioned, Detroit, Michigan, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have 2 areas that are in relatively prosperous states, but are in parts of the state that are considered relatively distressed compared to the rest of the state. So upstate New York, Buffalo, New York is in upstate New York, relatively distressed compared to New York City. And Bakersfield, California is in the inland part of California, which has not done as well as the booming coastal cities like San Francisco or San Diego. And then finally, we have some so-called Sunbelt cities that have been high-growth cities, Salt Lake City and Miami. Well, what do you see here? Well, okay, so San Francisco has done great. Again, the groups here are sub-BA, people with less than a 4-year college degree, less than a bachelor's degree, people with a bachelor's degree or more, folks that are African-American, and folks that are white, non-Hispanic group. Again, these are all trends relative to the U.S. average real earnings change, although during this time period, I should mention, once you control for education and age mix, real earnings did not really increase that much overall in the U.S. So San Francisco might be what you'd expect. Well-educated groups did well. White groups did well. Black and people with less than a BA did not do well. You could say this is maybe due to local prices going up quite a bit. And those groups didn't benefit, on net did not benefit as much. On the other hand, Minneapolis, a high-tech city, shows that all these groups, their real earnings went up very well. Rust Belt cities, Detroit, Michigan, Enrico already mentioned, suffered from deindustrialization. All the groups did poorly compared to the U.S. during this time period. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who was highlighted earlier as a city that's made a successful transition, yes, with the multiplier effects on services, people with less than a bachelor's degrees have done quite well in Pittsburgh, controlling for housing prices. On the other hand, this is not matched by what happened to Black workers. So the trends for Black workers are pretty bad in Pittsburgh, even though people with less than a BA overall did pretty well. On the other hand, Buffalo, New York actually had pretty strong performance both for Black workers and less educated workers. Bakersfield, California, disaster for just about everyone. And then on the other hand, big contrast. Even though Miami and Salt Lake City are both high-growth cities in the U.S., Miami actually saw real earnings losses for all these groups. And on the other hand, Salt Lake City showed particularly favorable trends towards less educated workers and Black workers. Now, the first thing I want to emphasize is I don't fully understand all these trends. So I don't know what's going on in Salt Lake City. I mean, I don't know if everyone here in the audience knows this. I mean, Utah traditionally is a heavily Mormon state, although Salt Lake City the city itself is not majority Mormon, but so it's a little bit of a different kind of place in the U.S. So maybe, who knows what's going on. I mean, I actually think people need to research more. What is going on in Salt Lake City? We need to look more at Pittsburgh. Why have Black workers not done well? Why have people less educated workers, even though less educated workers have done well? So I think we need to understand these trends more. Right now we're trying to get clues to some of the research we've done. And if we turn to the next slide. So one thing we did do some descriptive regressions that I think gives some clues. Very disparate trends. One thing we found is that if you look at predicted job growth based on national industry trends, so the industry mix of the area interacted with national industry trends, if the area has more favorable industry mix in terms of these industries have good, strong job growth nationally in the U.S. or good, strong wage growth nationally in the U.S., we look at that predicted shocks to job growth and shocks to wages. And we find that has very large effects on those with less than a BA degree, less than a bachelor's degree, or on white workers, but has little effects on workers with a bachelor's degree or more, or Black workers. Now, with the bachelor degrees, you might explain that by saying they're more mobile, they're more affected by the national labor market, maybe the local labor market growth doesn't matter as much. Black workers is a pretty disturbing trend, given that in the U.S. context, although there was rapid, some considerable improvement in reduction in racial disparities in the 50s and 60s in the U.S., since then there's been overall, I would say, relatively little progress towards narrowing racial disparities between Black and white Americans since the 70s. And it's a little disturbing that job growth in the area doesn't seem to help them that much. And could be due to residential segregation, racial discrimination, a variety of factors. Second thing, we also looked, similarly to Enrico, at baseline college grad share of the population. We found this did predict earnings growth for workers with a BA or more, which conglomeration economies are important, and particularly for this group, did not really predict much for the other groups. So basically, bachelor's workers benefit quite a bit from being in a commuting zone with a high baseline share of college grads. Other workers, not so much. And finally, one of the most disturbing findings, just from the descriptive regression, again, these are not causal, just descriptive. If a local labor market, a commuting zone, had a high percentage of its population that at baseline was Black, it tends to have slower earnings growth, particularly for Black workers, but also to a somewhat lesser extent for white workers, and for also less educated workers as a whole. So this is pretty disturbing. I mean, again, it could be due to that areas with a high Black population share have more issues with residential segregation, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very disturbing trend given that, one U.S. social goal is to narrow racial disparities. Now, we've also done some case studies of what does work. So next slide, please. So what does work? I want to highlight 3 examples of things I think that show some potential for changing labor market outcomes for workers in local economies. The first I'm going to highlight is Grand Rapids, Michigan. I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan, so Grand Rapids is about an hour north of me. So I'm pretty familiar with it. Grand Rapids, Michigan is arguably the most successful manufacturing-oriented city in the U.S. in maintaining its manufacturing. So, over the period, I'm looking at 1990, so manufacturing in the U.S. declined more than 20%, 25%. Manufacturing jobs in Grand Rapids actually went up by 10%. And this is an area that started at baseline having twice the national average share in manufacturing. And basically, Grand Rapids did this. They doubled down on manufacturing as a growth strategy. They did not say necessarily, well, they did to some extent, but they focused a lot on their existing manufacturing base. They set up manufacturing extension services to work with companies to improve their productivity. They improved job training programs in local community colleges to help serve manufacturing. They tried to maintain family ownership of some of the small and medium-sized manufacturing firms in the area, tried to find local buyers for these companies. And at the same time, they did, to some extent, follow a high-tech strategy, particularly in healthcare. A bunch of wealthy people in the area paid Michigan State University a lot of money to move most of its medical school from East Lansing, Michigan to Grand Rapids, Michigan. They set up a whole health corridor and a health research center. And in the area of manufacturing, one thing they've done is they have a lot of auto suppliers that bend metal or mold plastic that are auto parts. They've encouraged some of them to diversify, and if you're bending metal or molding plastic, you can also make medical instruments and medical supplies of various sorts, and they've encouraged some of them to diversify in that area. So they've been able to achieve some manufacturing job growth as well as growth in health-related industries. So they've built on their existing assets in a very creative way. Let me give it a second example of what works. Next slide. So this is a small little area. This is Crosby, Ironton, Minnesota. And it is in northern Minnesota. It's on the fringes of what is called the Iron Range of Minnesota. And this area, traditionally, a lot of its economic activity rested on open pit iron mines. But the area has been depressed for years. All the open pit iron mines have closed down. The area has been losing population, losing jobs. So what do people do? I like to use this example of when you have lemons, make lemonade, which is, I don't know if that's an expression in other countries, but it's an expression in the US. You have lemons, make lemonade. And so here they had these open pit iron mines. A lot of them filled in with water and became lakes. Here you can see a lake. And what the area did with funding from the state of Minnesota was to develop a very intricate network of high quality mountain biking trails. You can see people biking along here. They now have regular national races of mountain biking there. They have some incredible trails there. I've been up there. It's really quite striking. This has attracted some tourism. It's attracted some people wanting a second home there. It's attracted some people who want to work remotely there. You can work remotely there, and it's about a 2.5-hour drive to get to the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. There are brew pubs that have started up, Airbnb, bicycle shops, etc. Is it made the area a miracle? No, but it's significantly revitalized the local economy. They've looked at their assets and they've redeveloped some of them. Next slide. Third thing that works, or at least promising, as I mentioned, one of the most disturbing trends is these racial disparities. And the question is, what do you do about it, given residential racial segregation in the US? And one thing that is, I think, worth exploring are what are called neighborhood employment hubs. Now, I should mention the Upton Institute has a research division, which I'm in, and then has an operations division that runs all the job training programs in Southwest Michigan, the area around Kalamazoo, and has for many, many years. And in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is a half-hour away from me, home historically of the Kellogg Cereal and Food Company, and also home of the Kellogg Foundation, one of the wealthiest foundations in the world. And the Kellogg Foundation has funded the Upton Institute Operations Division to run neighborhood employment hubs in high poverty neighborhoods of Kalamazoo, and of Battle Creek, rather. And the idea here is that you move your employment services, your job training services, your efforts, job access services out of downtown office buildings, and you put them in subsidized housing projects, African-American churches, community agencies. There's one at the local jail. And these are staffed by people who are neighborhood residents, who are familiar with the neighborhood. And the idea is that this makes the services more accessible. It also makes the workers much more aware of the neighborhood's needs. Do we know this works? No, not from experimental or even quasi-experimental evidence. On the other hand, I think it's a very promising approach to try to overcome some of these racial disparities. Next slide. Okay, so to summarize, what we find these very disparate earnings trends, and then in fact, oftentimes gains for people with more than a bachelor's degree seem to have little correlation with what happens for less educated groups or for Black workers. It's also the case that not all disadvantaged workers are alike, that the less educated worker trends are not necessarily the same as the trends for Black workers. Now, I should say, how does this translate into other OECD countries with different ethnic makeups or whatever? My view is one size does not fit all, one trend does not fit all. If you're trying to solve the local labor market problems of disadvantaged groups, different disadvantaged groups may need different solutions. So I do not think the policies to solve the problems, for example, of less educated workers in the US are necessarily the same as the policies to solve the problems of Black workers. These are disparate problems that need somewhat different solutions. They may overlap to some degree, but somewhat different. As I said, these case studies, my view is that in addition to pushing education, I agree with Enrico on that, I think there are a variety of strategies we can do that basically look at, let's look at what the local assets are, and let's see if we can redeploy them in some way that might be in a growth area. And finally, I really do think in the US context in particular, we really need to think about neighborhood interventions because we have tremendous racial segregation by neighborhood in the US, and we need to figure out how to better link Black workers to available jobs, because it's frequently the case that even in areas that otherwise are doing quite well, that the Black workers in those areas are not doing well. So let me just stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim. I think it was a great example how to make economic research impactful for policy. I think the concrete examples that you gave were very useful to understand also the nitty-gritty details of these policies. Plus, I'm also passionate about mountain bikes, so the Crosby example is particularly interesting for me. And speaking of policy, I think now we have the perfect speaker to link the dots of the discussion and try to explain to us how these insights can be integrated into the activities of governments and lawmakers. So we have here Irene Tinagli, who is an economist by training, but for the last 10 years, she has been a member of parliament, policymaker, first in Italy and then in the European Parliament, and where she has also been the chair of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. So Irene, what can policymakers do to take stock of the findings of the insights of discussion we are having today?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I really want to thank you for inviting me. This is an extremely interesting topic and seminar with very distinguished speakers, and so I'm really honored to be with you and to discuss. I hope I will be, at the same level. It was a very high-level presentations. Well, I have to be honest. The first thing that I thought after I actually read the material and looked at the papers before, and especially when I read Enrico Moretti's paper, I thought, oh my God, we did it all wrong. And I'm thinking, especially at the European level, European policymakers have no say in education policies, and we don't have that kind of competencies. So maybe the European Union is a kind of peculiar. The kind of experience that I can bring is different from experiences that could be, applied in the United States or in other jurisdictions, because we are a union, but we are not a federal state, and the European policy making is limited in the, how many things we can do. And indeed, thinking about how important, how crucial education, college education and human capital is in terms of regional growth, innovation, and resilience, as the paper and the work of Moretti shows, it's really poses challenges to us as a European policymakers, because we don't have that kind of leverage. So I think this should make us think a lot, but let me also try to explain what we did, what has been done in the years at the European level, but also at the national levels, to try to accompany and mitigate the effect of deindustrialization in certain regions. So we used a lot of, as also I saw in a slide, a lot of regional funds. What it is, these are cohesion. We call it cohesion policy. The European Union gives to member states funds and money that can be used to address certain priorities, to mitigate problems in terms of poverty or lack of infrastructure. So in trying to increase, to help these member states to be integrated, to reduce divergences inside the European Union. And I think that, and also in terms of training, for example, they have been used to support a little bit the human capital formation, but those are different kinds of trainings. Many times they were and they have been directed to really the most fragile components of society, people that have been unemployed for a long time. So it's not really the kind of education that I suppose has been investigated in these papers, which is higher type of degrees. So I think that these policies have been working to mitigate the effects of the industrialization in certain areas. But maybe it's not just about addressing the industrialization. I think they might have helped bringing some new forms of industrialization in areas that had been marginalized for a very long time, by helping them building infrastructures, because this was also something that the European funds were directed to. I think that now that, I'm sorry, I'm brainstorming with you a little bit. I wrote down many things, but now after having seen the presentations, I improvise a little bit. But in this legislature, we will have to review our cohesion policies and the regulation underlying the allocation of our funds. And I hope that we can take some inspiration from this, because I believe that to too long. For decades, we've been, as I said, directing these funds either towards infrastructure, railways, highways, or things like that, or these kind of more cohesion policies for the really most fragile areas, regions, and people. But I think now we need to think about something that is more fit for the needs that we have today. And especially what I was thinking is that education, of course, is a member state's competence, but it's always been seen as an expenditure. So actually, the paradox is that not only the European Union has no competence in direct competences in financing or supporting education, but with our own fiscal rules that are, of course, important to keep on track all the member states and align a little bit the national budgets and to guarantee convergence, but our fiscal rules treat education as an expenditure, not as an investment. So actually, we've been in the situations in those periods where we had crisis, and then also the deindustrialization for many countries have also implied a lower budget or problems in addressing growth. In those years, many countries had to cut on education as well, on healthcare and other expenditures. So maybe starting to think a little bit on how we could reframe this and start to look at education not just as an expenditure, but as an investment that can help regions to grow and to address deindustrialization. This could be something, definitely a lesson that we should learn from not only from the experience of these years, but also from the studies of prominent scholars. So thank you for these inputs to thinking. So I also would like to now to throw on the table another issue, because this webinar is focused on deindustrialization, which has been the major issue for many areas, many countries, and the European Union as well in the past years. But after the COVID crisis in the recent years, what we are discussing, the public policy debate now in Brussels and in many other regions, is also is not so much about how to address deindustrialization, but how to phase and support a reindustrialization. So trying to bring back the certain productions, trying to revive certain manufacturing activities, especially in those sectors that are believed to be particularly crucial for development, growth, resilience. This is the result of what happened during the COVID crisis, where the issues in global supply chains made some areas realize how dependent they were from external areas. This also is related to the wars that have broken in our borders and in the Middle East and in Ukraine, geopolitical tensions, the relationship that have been deteriorating with Russia, the trade wars that have been opening in the past few years. So the global context has completely changed and has refocused a little bit the policy debate on industrial policies. So now we are thinking in terms of reindustrialize, but I believe that many of the things that have been illustrated and have been faced in these presentations can be applied also in the type of debate that we are facing right now. Because of course, if we want to develop new industries or bring back industries that we used to have and we lost some decades ago, of course, having educated workforce, having human capital infrastructure and everything that attains to that dimension, it is very important. It is crucial. And right now, I don't think that we are including this component in our debate enough. So what are we discussing now is what kind of industries we should focus on, what kind of tools and instruments can we use and leverage to support the creation and development of certain industries that are considered strategic. I think in terms of, I don't know, clean technologies, like hydrogen or batteries, or these are electric automobiles or things like that. But what kind of tools? Is the traditional kind of incentives to support the demand enough to support the development of an industry? I don't think so, but some member states are talking about it. Even if you wanted to put in place incentives, you would bump into state aid rules, and this in our jurisdiction is not allowed. But it is allowed. It's been allowed in other jurisdictions like China and like the United States. So the regulations that we have been put in place in our continent for decades are regulations that are set and created for the old world, for the old kind of geopolitical context, and for the old style industrial policies. And now we have to rethink everything. And so this is a very, very difficult, but also interesting time for policymakers. I believe not just in Europe, but everywhere, because we are seeing attempts in trying to be creative in the United States, in China, but also in other countries in how to address the challenges of reindustrialization, or at least to develop new industries that are considered to be strategic and crucial in the new geopolitical scenario. So I don't have really answers on what it works. I believe that the policies, like the regional cohesion policies that we put in place in the past to address the industrialization, they have helped. A little bit. I mean, definitely they have helped, but I also believe that we have to rethink everything right now because many things have changed, and I would be happy to hear also inputs on that. And finally, just a personal note, I'm very happy to hear, but the example about Pittsburgh, because I lived in Pittsburgh for 8 years, and I can testimony, all the efforts that the city has put in place to react to the industrialization and the deep crisis, and definitely all of those recipes applied. Investment in the availability of human capital, but also investments in healthcare, in high-tech, the availability of research and development centers, CMU, Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh for healthcare, and CMU for robotics engineering. Those were very, very important drivers, I believe. So in that sense, I hope that all the policies that we have put in place in Europe in trying to support the creation of research centers or new research projects or technological infrastructure, I hope that they can pay and help the growth process and innovation process. But I would just stop here, and I'd be very, very much interested in hearing some feedbacks and suggestions.
Great, fantastic, Irene. You really managed to give to touch upon the most important issues, I think, in the policy agenda today in Europe and beyond, and to link them to the discussion we are having today. So I think it was very, very useful. There's time now for a couple of questions. Well, actually, I'm not able to make justice to all the questions in the chat, but I'll try to pick up a couple. So a highly voted one is about migration and labor mobility, which of course, can play quite an important role. I guess positive and negative impact depending on the situation. So it would be great if you can elaborate a bit on that. And then there are a couple of questions that I'm asking, basically, which are the other interventions that could work, that can be complementary to investing in education. I know both Tim and Enrico made quite some work on the evaluation of place-based policies, and now also we are a lot of debate about place-based industrial policy with the two that are blending in many cases. There are some mention, for example, about intervention to retain businesses and to avoid mass layoff. And also a question was also pointing to the treaty by Richard Florida, which is a type of research Irene is very familiar with. So maybe we can start in reverse order. Maybe we can start with Tim, then going to Enrico, then completing with Irene for a quick round. But I ask you really to be brief because we are unfortunately running out of time.
What question do you want me to address?
You can choose, really. It's about labor mobility, it's about the complementarity of different place-based policies, and so. And
well, I mean, I guess labor mobility, one thing I would say is that I don't think, look, encouraging people to be, look, I think I'm all in favor of of loosening up housing markets in Silicon Valley, Boston, DC, New York in the US, et cetera. And, I think that would be more economically efficient. It would promote economic growth overall in the US. Enrico has some estimates of that, what it might do. It would help some of those who move. The reality is, though, encouraging people to move out of Detroit or move out of Flint or move out of distressed rural areas does not help those left behind and will never occur at a sufficient scale. I mean, look, Flint, Michigan, say, is an industrial area that experienced massive job loss in autos. People moved out of Flint for years. There is a lot of out-migration from Flint. Does it help those? But you're never going to have enough because people have strong local ties that are important to them. People have ties to communities. And when people move out, the evidence suggests it reduces labor demand as much as it reduces labor supply. So the employment rate is no better for those left behind. Same is true at the neighborhood level. Encouraging people to move out of high crime, high poverty neighborhoods does not help the people left behind in those neighborhoods. So I think the reality is, if you really want to help people in distressed places, just telling them they should all move out is not a solution. People won't move out. It hurts those left behind.
Fantastic. I think in your paper, there's a very nice quote by Adam Smith, if I remember correctly, that a person is not the type of luggage that is very easy to move around, right?
Right.
Exactly. Okay, Enrico, you want to comment on that as well?
I think building on Tim's perspective, labor mobility does play a role in explaining the differences across countries that we uncover in our project. Remember, when we look at what percentage of former manufacturing hubs thrive and are able to recover, Germany has almost half, and the US has 17%, is the lowest. And one plausible and I think very realistic explanation is that labor mobility is much higher in the US. And so when a place is hit by a bad shock, people tend to leave much more quickly. And that induces that negative spiral that Tim is alluding to. People leave, businesses close, you don't just lose the manufacturing jobs, you lose all the local service jobs that support in a typical city, even more families than manufacturing. And so labor mobility is an important explainer of our finding, and also explains the difference that we see between the US, which is an extreme in terms of labor mobility, and other European countries where labor mobility, for the better or the worse, is more limited. I also want to just very quickly to highlight Tim's and Irene's point earlier about, I don't think there is one recipe for recovery that applies to every single community. I think they both explain much better than I can do it. But essentially, I think the recipe for recovery needs to be based on the local strengths of a community. And I think it's almost like having one blueprint that applies to every community is probably destined to fail. I think we need to build on the local strengths of a place. And I think the example, Tim example, Irene's example are very illustrative of that.
One size does not fit all. That should be the slogan for local economic development and place prosperity.
Yeah, that is an approach that we embrace at OECD since quite a while as well when we work on place-based policy. So, Irene, do you want to add something as well before we move to the final remarks?
Yeah, this is, one of the reasons why when we set up in place the Recovery and Resilience Facility in Europe, setting up a fund that for the first time, leveraged a big chunk of European debt, but then it was distributed to the member states, telling them within this priorities and conditionalities in terms of respect for the environment, etc. You decide what you need to do with this money. You give us your plan. You elaborate your plan, and you will have to do it talking to regions, talking to cities, talking to representatives of all the of society, because in a case like the one we faced over the COVID, even if it was an external shock that was the same for everybody, but every region experienced it differently and could leverage different things and had different problems to be addressed. So, and it worked. I think it worked because we managed many regions, even those that didn't have, wouldn't have enough money and resources to recover by themselves. Thanks to this plan, managed to recover very, very quickly. We got out of the COVID crisis in less than 2 years. 2 years later, almost all the European member states were at the same GDP level as pre-crisis. Just to give you an example, with the great financial recession, where we didn't have that kind of European plan, it took member states, in some cases, 7 to 8 years to recover, to fully recover. So, so this is important that there are given some freedom to adapt and have a different intervention. Although, if I may add one little thing, not only in Europe we have a lower labor mobility, but we also have, unfortunately, lower capital mobility that in some cases are very, very important to support investments, because, of course, we cannot think to do everything with public investment and public money. So we need, and the reason why, for example, in Pittsburgh, they managed to recover is that, yes, they had human capital, they had research hubs, they had this amazing infrastructure, but this attracted a lot of private capital and investments. And I could see investment coming from California or from, different states within the United States, and which is much more difficult to see within the European Union, because we still have some borders and different legislation from member states to member states, which make it harder for investments to be really cross-border. And this was probably one of the problems also of the Recovery and Resilience Facility to recover from the COVID, was in some cases too much focused on national policies and not so much in building cross-border and really European projects. So trying to increase also this kind of coordination and create a real single market would be, I think, very useful to support investments.
One thing I want to mention is if people are interested in Pittsburgh, and Enrico referred to this paper and was one of the things he cited. Ben Armstrong, who's now at MIT, has a very interesting paper that compares Pittsburgh with Cleveland in the U.S., where Pittsburgh was far more successful than Cleveland in recovering. And he tries to talk about what state and local policies played a role in that. We published a version of that paper in a journal I co-edited, Economic Development Quarterly, and then we had someone from Cleveland, Ohio, disagree with Ben, and someone from Pittsburgh disagree with him as well. And then Ben responded. So you can see a whole range of opinions as to why Pittsburgh did better than Cleveland and whether policy played any role in
it. Very nice.
Thank you all. I also take the opportunity to remind that you find links to a review and an overview of the teams and Enrico's work in the chat. So please click on it and then check. There's really a wealth of very interesting research. It's about time to wrap up. So I'm really happy to welcome the last speaker, with our own Anna Rubin, who is the manager of the OECD Local Development Forum and also leads the OECD project on transforming places, which we mentioned at the beginning. So welcome, Anna, and would like to ask you which are the main take-home messages of today's discussion in your view.
So an easy question for me, right? I think I might have one of the toughest jobs because this discussion has been so rich. But there are kind of three things that really stood out to me from reading the papers and today's discussion. The first is that both these papers really address the need to advance our understanding of the diversity of outcomes kind of within and across places. I think in recent years, we've really seen a shift in the public debate about the need to kind of go beyond national averages. This is something that we at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities have really been trying to advocate for a long time. And I think in conversations around the geography of discontent and left behind places, we're really seeing this idea kind of taking hold in the kind of the broader public and academic debate. But these papers really demonstrate the need that we need to go even more granular than that. We need to understand why economic transformation delivers for some residents but not others, or why some places may look similar at the outset follow really different development trajectories. But beyond recognizing this diversity, which is interesting, is really the important part is understanding why. So Enrico's paper identifies skills of the local workforce as an important factor to consider. And we heard from Tim about some of these really specific local initiatives that really build on local assets that kind of helped transform these economies. And this is a topic that we at the OECD are really going to be looking into as part of our new work on transforming places. There's a couple of different ways that we're going to be doing this that I think really link to the conversations today. So one thing that we want to do is understand a little bit more the role of what we're calling social or soft infrastructure in local communities and what role that might play in local economic transformation. So I think that really kind of echoes some of Irene's comments about thinking about education as an investment, not as an expenditure. So we think about this as part of the local infrastructure. Again, it's not an expenditure and it's an investment in the local infrastructure. We also see more need that I think, as Tim alluded to bridge kind of quantitative and qualitative research to unpack the factors that we know matter, but are difficult or impossible to quantify. So for example, next year, we're going to be releasing new work looking at the role of different types of local leaders. And actually here we have a case study from Grand Rapids looking at the role that their economic development organization played in their transformation. In the coming year or so, we're also going to be identifying these places that are kind of outliers to do more in-depth work via case studies. So for example, from Enrico's paper, we'd be really interested in looking at these kind of 1/3 of manufacturing hubs that manage to kind of outperform expectations. The final thing I want to say is that, if we think about the diversity, why the diversity, but then of course the really important question for us at the OECD is the so what? How can we turn this into actionable advice for policymakers? And again, we got some really interesting insights from the presentations today. We heard about investing in education and upskilling the local workforce, about building on local assets, about bringing employment and wraparound services directly to the doorstep of people who need it most. But as Tim said, and Irene said, and Enrico, I think, said somewhere in his comments too, one size does not fit all. We really need to build on kind of unique local assets and strengths, whether it's a university or a well-funded business community with strong ties that's willing to invest in your local community. When we're thinking about advice to policymakers, I think it's also important to recognize that, as Irene alluded to, we can't think of policymakers as a monolithic entity either. It's questions about what's the role of national policymakers, what's the role of local policymakers, and what's the role of kind of supranational policymakers like those at the EU. And then the final thing I want to say is that one of the things that we really think is important in these conversations is to understand how these lessons from previous transitions can apply to future ones. As Rudiger said in the opening, deindustrialization, of course, is not just a thing of the past, but we also know it's not the only type of shocks that can have important localized impacts. So, we've heard about the experience of Salo, Finland, where Nokia downsized. So it was a high-tech industry that kind of closed down. So it's not an example of deindustrialization necessarily, but another place where a local economic shock really had an important local impact. Or for the experience of seaside resort towns in the UK that saw their tourism economy dry up as low-cost options kind of opened up across Europe. Or to the other point, how do we take these lessons from deindustrialization and kind of apply them to these questions of reindustrialization? So altogether, I think these papers and our discussions today helped us to advance in answering some of these questions, but perhaps even more importantly, it helped us as the OECD kind of hone in on some of the questions that we need to be asked going forward. So hopefully this is just the start of a conversation, and I want to again thank all of our panelists and the audience members today for helping us get there. So Carlo, back to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was very effective wrap up. So yeah, you had a difficult task but you you are really up to the task. Okay, now really time to wrap up. You are perfect on time, so thank you very much for this as well. I thank you again the standard speaker who joined us today for their generous contribution, and all the attendants for being here today. On screen you can find the links to our web pages, so please take a look and feel free to reach out to us if you like to know more. Also, we were really happy to hear from you about other examples of transforming places, because we will be very happy to add them to our analysis. Also, let me extend and let me also thank you, Elisa Campestrina, Roberto Chizzari, who ensured that everything was running smoothly on the background. Have a nice rest of the day, and I hope to see you again at the next SPL webinar. Thank you.